The next section, and this will be the section that probably we're going to end because we have very limited time, is changing economic and demographic realities, African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants. Okay? So the first thing I would like to say here is just that well-being of African Americans in the early 20th century was worse than at any time since the end of slavery. And this goes back to the point I was making much earlier, that even though we say great things about the changes that America was going through, those changes were not impacting all segments of American society to the same degree, in the sense that after the end of slavery, you had Jim Crow, and you have sharecropping. You know what sharecropping means? Like initially, some black people were promised certain acres of land at the end of Reconstruction or during Reconstruction, but at the end of Reconstruction, during the kind of bargain between the North and the South, land was returned to the former slave owners, and because they owned the land, now the black people were free. But if you did not have any education, you didn't have any skills, you have to still go back and farm, but you do not have land. So what do? So you go and rent the land from the former slave owner or something like that. And then you cultivate some crops, you pay them at the end of the year or something like that. It's almost like another new kind of slavery, actually. It's not slavery, but there's a documentary called Slavery by another name or something like that. Okay, they call it sharecropping or something like that. So this was a very difficult time for people for black people in the United States, and we have to remember that, because when we discuss equal opportunity at the beginning of the course, we said you have to talk about cumulative advantage and cumulative disadvantage. So black people have this cumulative disadvantage. Native Americans had cumulative disadvantage over a long period of time, from one thing after the other. Okay, one thing after the other. Later on, you are going to see in this course that even after the Civil Rights Act was passed or something like that, immediately certain things came into existence that started making the lives of minorities, especially African Americans, really difficult in some areas. Okay, and the next populist revolt of the 1890s created fear among white elite. So there were some revolts, and those revolts, as I mentioned much earlier, often they are because some people feel dissatisfied. And this is something that is very, very important. You can make very good arguments about how everybody should take care of himself, herself, this and that, or whatever, okay? But if we are going to live in the same society, and in spite of all your sophisticated arguments, but some people are marginalized while some people are doing really very well, it's going to have some consequences. You remember in the 1960s, there was a time when there were just too many demonstrations in American cities because black people just felt dissatisfied, totally ignored. Okay? There were so many demonstrations such that a committee was set up to investigate what were the reasons or something like that. Okay? So we shouldn't just get carried away with making all these sophisticated arguments that will ignore the reality on the ground. And then southern states passed Jim Crow laws, which means the segregation laws. These segregation laws, I don't want to get so much into that because we don't want to have the time, but the churches were segregated, the neighborhoods were segregated, the schools were segregated. So everything was segregated. We live in the same society, but no, there's also this kind of segregation. And remember that there are Southern Europeans, or there are other European immigrants who were also segregated at one point. But after the Second World War, as you're going to see, the Federal Housing Authority was able to provide loans to many of these people, especially the veterans, to build houses in the suburbs. They suburbanized America, where all these former white immigrants who are segregated now were gathered together, and they intermingle with each other. So a new kind of society was created in suburban America, and they left black people and other minorities in the city. So this is another chapter in American history because of all this Jim Crow segregation. And then the Supreme Court in 1896 approved separate but equal doctrine, the issue of equal protection under the law for all people. So what am I trying to draw your attention here? What I'm trying to draw your attention to here is the Supreme Court in 1896 made a decision that said to treat people separately but equally is okay. In other words, it's okay for people to attend different schools, to live in different neighborhoods or whatever, and all those kind of things. You can treat them separately, black this way, white this way, but make sure that they are all treated equally. In other words, the quality of either the education or the services that are provided are really equal. Now, in reality, it was not equal, okay? So the issue here, as I said, the 14th Amendment, I think the 14th Amendment says that every American citizen has equal protection under the law, okay? So in this case, there was a violation of this. In theory, the black people were supposed to be provided equal services that were equal in quality compared to whites. But in reality, it didn't happen like that. And I want to draw something here, because sometimes in this discussion, there's a way, so far in our discussion, you see very, very clearly, and this will be the last lecture, so let me also make this point, and that is the fact that sometimes we over-spiritualize American history. And what I mean by we over-spiritualize it is simply means like everything that happened was just kind of ordained by God this way or whatever. But if you are to think of this issue of equal protection or whatever, separate but equal, from a Christian perspective, you would have to ask, now this will not be tolerated, this idea, okay? You know, it was changed later on. But do you think that the Holy Spirit at that time has limited understanding, and that was why he gave this kind of understanding to the Supreme Court justices to make this decision? Or was it just the social and material interests of the people in the country? So sometimes there are times, and this is not just happening just in the United States, okay? I can give you examples from Africa, from Latin America, from other parts of the world, where people who make decisions based on their social and material interests, but then quickly they bring a sacred canopy to cover the decision, almost like blaming God or something like that, okay? So just understand that this idea of separate but equal was really actually problematic. And then rationalization came from 1915 from a film called The Birth of a Nation, where black people were portrayed as a threat and violent creatures. So what does this mean? There's a movie, and I think you can find this online, called Birth of a Nation. So this was just after Reconstruction, and we're getting into the Jim Crow era. The black people were supposed to be equal. Remember that. Black people were supposed to be chattel. Chattel means your property. Okay, and Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America, amazingly, he made this point. He said the problem with many white people was not even abolition slavery, but the idea that this person that used to be your property, okay, your chattel, and then you wake up one day and you're told that this property is now equal to you. Not only can he or she cast vote, but he can be or she can be voted into office. It wasn't easy. And let's be frank about it. This is not something that is only a problem in the United States. You go to other societies where some people have had some privileges over a long period of time, and then now you're telling them that they have to create a society where everybody is equal. They feel very uncomfortable about that, because they feel like, I used to be at the top here, and now you're telling me that we're all going to be equal. So they will try to do everything they can to make it difficult for the person that is kind of rising up or being elevated from just enjoying the same kind of privileges. So this movie called Birth of a Nation, at that time, the black people were supposed to be equal to whites. And so the movie was produced. If you see in the movie, the way it was white people who acted the movie, but they colored themselves to look like black. The behavior of the black person was portrayed as very violent and very crude. And in some parts of the movie, it was portrayed as if one of the major preoccupations of the black man is the sexuality of the white woman. And so be very careful. Don't allow the black man to come very close to the white woman, because he's preoccupied about her sexuality. And amazingly, the president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, at that time, screened the movie in the White House. Okay, so to show you this. Okay, 2 or 3 more points, and then we are done. Booker T. Washington's belief that African Americans should focus on acquiring skills and better work habits found support among whites. So let me put this in context. If you really want to understand Booker T. Washington, you have to compare him or contrast him with W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the leader of the Niagara Fall movement or something like that. If you like, within the black community or within the minority community, there are two different approaches to dealing with life in America. So Booker T. Washington's approach and Tuskegee Institute came as a result of the effort of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington's idea, and there was a time he was addressing a fair in Atlanta, and the whole idea that he was going to address the white people at that time offended many of the white people because he was brought there. But amazingly, when he started addressing the white people and they heard what he was saying, they started clapping for him. Because essentially what he was saying in his speech was that the rate at which the black person improves or makes progress in America will depend on the pleasure of the white people. That was his position, okay? Almost like saying fingers are not created equals. We are willing to do whatever you do to help you up to a point where you feel comfortable, then you can move us forward or something like that. Actually, Booker T. Washington almost sees the responsibility of the black person surviving to be, or the black person's problem to be the black person himself or herself, okay? So his idea was that let's create a school, let's teach them some basic skills, things like that, so that they can walk here and there or something like that, okay? But don't necessarily encourage them to go and get educated at Harvard. And you know W.E.B. Du Bois got educated at Harvard. He was the first African-American to get a Ph.D. at Harvard. So W.E.B. Du Bois, however, was saying that there's need for structural change. And the problem that black people were experiencing at that time in the country was not the experience of not only black people, but other minorities. They were not the people who created the problems, but the system created the problem and put them in there. So now the system should take responsibility for that. So this became two different approaches. But amazingly, the white community was more willing to embrace the ideas of Booker T. Washington because he seemed to be just saying this. So just understand that these are two different approaches. And then lastly, the point I would just like to make is the progressivism was tied to the efforts to restrict rights of African Americans, especially in the South. So there's what you might call ambivalence of progressivism. So what does this mean? So, and let me conclude with this. What this simply means is just that there's a lot of ambivalence in American history, okay? Sometimes when we celebrate or whatever, I know it is not nice to say this, but so we are doing all these reforms and things like that. But even when these reforms were taking place during the progressive era, in the South, from 1900 to 1930, no, the black person's full humanity was not really recognized. No, it was not recognized. He was considered to be somebody below. And the idea was remember later on they created all these policies of if you want to vote, you have to be literate. If you are not literate, you are not going to be allowed to vote or something like that, okay, to register to vote. But you deny these people education. And if you read Mark Twain's, I think, was it The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or something like that, there's a book where he made the argument, Mark Twain made the argument that he used the language, black people speak in that book and they use, if you like, what you might call improper English or broken English. And when some people read it, they were very angry with Mark Twain that why should he write a book with that kind of improper English language? But he said, you deny these people education. You deny them the opportunity to be educated. And now when they don't speak correct grammar, you are complaining about it. If you don't want them to speak this improper English, then take the responsibility and provide them the opportunity to get good education. So there was ambivalence. Ambivalence is like, yes, we're a progressive society, we want to change things, but on the other hand, we are concerned about equality. These people used to be this, we are concerned. So there's some kind of ambivalence. And this ambivalence is not to the same degree all over the country. Some parts of the country, like in the South, it was more a serious issue, okay, compared to the North. But the interesting thing is that you remember many of the black people in the South migrated to the North. Some of them migrated to Chicago. And amazingly, though, when they migrated to Chicago, there's this documentary called The Promised Land where you see Martin Luther King Jr. in Chicago saying that actually racism in the North was even worse than in the South. Why? Let me conclude with this. He said that simply because in the South, you had what he called dominative racism, or what we might call dominative racism. In other words, dominative racism means white people had no problem staying relatively close with with black people, but the black person would have to accept his or her inferior position, period. Okay? But in the North, the white people did not want to have anything to do with black people. They are not willing to dominate them, but it is called aversive racism. Aversive racism means I don't want to go to the same school with you. I don't want to go to the same church with you. I don't want to live in the same neighborhood with you. So that's it. So when Martin Luther came to Chicago, he was concerned about that. Because in the South, the neighborhoods, black people were living close to whites. The only thing was just that the white people wanted the black people to accept their inferior position. And once this thing changed, the Civil Rights Act was passed or something like that, it became much easier. So I hope this gives you an idea of the complexity of how America evolved. When you hear all these things, sometimes you feel like, wow, so all these things really happen. And if you are somebody who is not an American listening to this lecture, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that America did not just drop from heaven. People had to organize and struggle to reform this country. And this reform will still continue if we want America or the world to be a better place. Thank you very much.